Right. So much of the insight approach is focused on unpacking and understanding what we're doing with our minds when we are engaging and disengaging in conflict, right? So we've spent a lot of time really exploring the interiority of the thinking around knowing, valuing, deciding, what are we doing when we're engaging in conflict behavior, defending against threat, interpersonal, when we're interacting with another person. But implicit in all of that, and for those of you who have been introduced to the insight loop, they're implicit in that are these carriers of consciousness and are the systems that we operate in, that we participate in every day, all the time, sleeping, waking, every moment. And so the insight approach accounts for those as well, and particularly when it comes to social conflict and situations of harm and pain and injustice. So today we're thinking about, well, how does the insight approach systems and broken systems specifically kind of as a window into how to understand social conflict, with the intention of figuring out as well how to change it, right? Where do we go? What are the steps that we take to start making a difference when it comes to challenges of systems and social conflict? So in this, I'm Dr. Megan Price. I'm part of EC, and Marnie Jull is with me today. We're doing this together, and what you'll see is kind of a conversation. And Elena is our community coordinator, and she's also going to be managing the chat. And why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Elena, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Elena Aseshinkava. I am a recent Royal Roads McCown grad and new community coordinator for EC. Part of my role is acting as a liaison between the EC community and the members and the steering committee. So I keep my ears out for what your needs might be and what works for you and what doesn't work. And I communicate that to the steering committee, and then we translate it into improvements and changes and things. And I also receive all the emails and all of your signups for the event. So I always get excited when I get those emails, and we update the website together. So we're working on growing and improving and delivering you really the best value for your time and for the members who've joined us. We're just really trying to grow this community and give you the best that we can. And it is such an honor to be here for you and to also just get to know all of these wonderful individuals. So thank you and welcome.
Wow, thank you for that, Elena. And so I'm Marnie Jull with a PhD, and I'm the associate faculty or associate professor and the program head of the conflict analysis and management program at Royal Roads. And it's lovely to see you and be here. I'm one of the founding members of Insight Collaborations International. And this has been a topic that we've been really working towards and thinking through, because so many of us are involved in one way or another around systems, and some are broken and some are going fine. And so I'm kind of wondering, as we get started into the chat, is what do you think a broken system is? And if you just want to put that into the chat, what would you define as a broken system? How would you come to understand, like, what is a broken system? What do you think? If there's any other questions that kind of animate. Okay, so stuck in some form of status quo, or meeting the goals that it was intended to serve, that it's no longer functioning. System that doesn't set out what doesn't do what it set out to do. Great, something not serving people. Fantastic answers. Where dysfunctional communication and inappropriate behaviors are commonplace, or a dysfunctional relationship between some insular group, a system that does more harm than good or intended good. Great. I mean, those are all very, very useful places for us to start this conversation. And thank you for contributing in the chat. It makes the conversations more vibrant. So Megan, I'm going to turn this to you because I'm going to play some of the role of asker, and these are some of the questions that Megan and I worked out together when we were planning for this. And then we'll have a conversation and really invite you to raise your hand, put up the mic, jump in, or put it in the chat about how you want to engage with us, because it's a conversation to the degree you want to be involved, and there's absolutely no expectation for you to be involved. So Megan, what's your sense of what is a broken system?
Yeah, no, I think that those of you who have contributed in the chat have it down, right? It's a system that doesn't work, or a system that that harms, a system that produces harm, I would say, is a broken system.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit later about the difference maybe between a broken system and a malicious system. But let's go back a little bit and talk about, like, what is a system to begin with.
Well,
and do you want to ask other people? Do you want to ask people in the chat about what's a system?
sure.
Yeah. So what is a system? They're out there in chat land. Next one, Canada. An organization trying to accomplish something. Great. Multiple actors with roles working together towards a particular goal. Leela, nice one. And Shauna has, again, this mechanism of operating around a goal or function in society. So yeah, you've got this, the social piece there. A structured form of a mutual relationship. Nice. And then there's a set of things that work together, interconnection, a collaboration of parts when the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. So that's another good one, Kenneth. And then Mariano's got that sense of the interconnected network. These are all kind of narrative, or these images that we have of systems. And then Vanessa has like an everything and anything. Nice. That's the very academic after hours Vanessa talking there. That's nice. So Megan, what's your sense of what is a system?
Well, I really love these contributions because, structured form of a mutual relationship, a mechanism operating around a goal or function in society, this interconnection, collaboration of parts. I think that what it's demonstrating, what it's showing, is that a system has lots of people involved, lots of people doing things in order to achieve something, right? And so there are lots of pieces, lots of parts, and it's not just pieces and parts, it's not just mechanical, but it's animated by that human functioning, right? That human decision making. And I think that's really captured in the system. Often we think of systems as structures and institutions that are very much outside of ourselves. There's the government, there's the DMV, there are the roads and the networks of transportation, there's Zoom, there's EC, there's universities, they're all the things, and they're out there and we participate in them, but really they're only possible because we're participating in them, right? And I think that's really the key point and the key link to insight.
Yeah, and that idea, that important recognition that there are systems that perpetuate what seem to be fixed, and that there's the word animation that's a key word, that there's roles and then there's people doing things that produce or are aimed towards. Do you want to say anything more about that, Megan? Around goals or goods, and about goods of order as well?
Yeah. Okay. So there are specific and particular terms that from Lonergan, really, that the insight approach draws on to explain what a system is. So all of what has been mentioned is captured by this, but these words are aimed to be precise. So a system does produce something, right? A system is set up to achieve a goal, or what we would call an intended good. Something that's good to do, a goal that is meant to be achieved, right? So the DMV is set up as a system to provide driver's licenses to people. Okay, that I don't know if you call it that in Canada. Oh my gosh.
That's the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Department of Motor Vehicles. Okay. Anyway, so we talk about in the inside approach, we talk about something called the good of order. Now that's a very cumbersome word. I'll just write that in the chat. Good of order, right? Really, it's a comprehensive term, and it's meant to capture systems, institutions, structures, any kind of setup, right, that's intended to create something, produce something, achieve something. And so it's a good of order because there's some sort of order to it, and it's meant to produce the good recurrently over and over and over again. So it's not just a system to do one thing. It's not, you know, right. It's the concept of a recurring production is very, very important. It's not just one driver's license, it's licenses for everybody.
So sometimes we use this thing of like, oh, I've got a secret system to organizing my bookshelf, which is a sense of it being like a methodical process or a systematic sequence, which is not the same thing as everyone has already said. But the idea of this good of order is something that sustains and endures and is repeated and repetitive. And so a building is a good of order. And it structures patterns of cooperation in particular ways, where we come in, how we gather, where we put our shoes. And so all of those things, that a building kind of reproduces, it's a fixed good that reproduces the way that we interact within it. So that's an example of that kind of recurring and ongoing good of order.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I like your idea of a building, Marnie, because it's visual. And even though it's made of bricks and windows and doors and, you know, paint and wood and whatever, a building is only functional because of this other component of the good of order, which is called a pattern of cooperation. So probably many of you have heard of that pattern of cooperation. Pattern of cooperation. Okay, so the pattern of cooperation is a term that explains how, as I kind of mentioned earlier, people, the building is really only a building in as far as people are using the building to live, work, operate their days, right? When people don't use the building anymore, when they don't pay attention to the building anymore, the building crumbles and it falls and it becomes a ruin and it's not a building anymore. Right?
There's a really good example of that I've used in other contexts. But if we look at then at a chair, so a chair also is a good of order that helps people sit. You can sit at a table or sit at a desk. But depending on the context, a chair can also be used as something to hit someone over the head with, or to be broken up for firewood. And so a chair is only animated in that role of like a place for people to sit to the degree that people participate and choose to do that. But it actually could be used in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also the difference between that kind of physical object and, you know, a system that is really more possible because of the decision making of people. So there are those physical objects, but there are also the cooperations of people in working together to create and reproduce intended goods. So what we're doing here is we're setting out kind of the components of system. So there's the good of order, which is the setup, which is the way that the thing is organized in order to produce. That setup is the decision making, right? Is the pattern of cooperation, really. Are the people agreeing to work together in some sort of organized way to make the system happen, to make the to continue to produce the product. So let's just say the license, or, you know, the apartment building, or, you know, the chairs around the table, sitting around the table for dinner, for example. So patterns of cooperation have one more level to them in their roles, right? And so everybody in this system takes on a role within a pattern of cooperation in order for good of order to actually function and produce something. So there's the doorman at the building. There are the people who live in the building and pay rent. There's the landlord, there's the super, there's the person who sweeps the snow out of the way. And so there are all these roles, and they're different and distinct and sometimes and often complementary. But those are the people who need to be working together in order to create this building as a home for people living in apartments. So we have three terms, right? Role, pattern of cooperation, and good of order.
And Megan, Shauna is just trying to clarify here. So the people define the use of the goods of order.
I like how you put that, Shauna. Yeah, ultimately, yes, it's people who are participating in and sustaining the goods of order that are producing the thing, right? I think what's interesting is that we don't often pay attention to the systems that we are participating in and perpetuating. And we're not really thinking about the system of the apartment building. This is where I live. This is my house. This is my room. This is my key. I need to sleep. I need to eat, and then I got to go to work. So this is more my place. But we often don't really think about the ways in which we're participating in systems, and that our decisions to do so are what are perpetuating them and making them so.
So I'll just use an example just Kim being here. Hi, Kim. Kim is a nurse. Has just made me think about that as sort of in the system of like wanting to care for people, then there needs to be, that's the intended good. And so then there needs to be roles. So there needs to be nurses, and then there needs to be people who help the nurses. And then there's also doctors that do that. There needs to be a hospital. So we have to set that up. And then there's got to be beds. And so all of these things kind of contribute to the system towards this care for patients. On Vancouver Island in particular, there's now some concern about the way that different people are cared for differently, so that Indigenous people have had experiences of not being cared for in the same way that non-Indigenous people are. And so then there's a way in which they're talking about this system is broken. It's not set up to have that equity of care and access that is sort of the explicit intended of like we care for all people. And so that's when we're starting to get into a sense of a system not functioning to its optimal. So it's providing excellent care, but there's a disjuncture then that occurs. So Megan, do you want to talk more then about that being like a broken or a suboptimal performance of a system, as opposed to something like a malicious system?
Okay. So it sounds to me like what you are saying is that there is an articulated goal of hospital care. Is that correct? And however, the outcomes of care are disparate depending on populations. And so there's harm, right? There's harm, or B, there's a disconnect between the intention and the actual outcome. So that's two ways that would indicate a system to be not functioning in the way that it's hoping to, right? I think there's something that's so interesting about this, and I think that it is that it's not functioning because it is people. I mean, they are people making these decisions, and people are imperfect, right? And so I think that we always have to remember that aspect of it, and that because we are people operating these systems, that there's also room for change and growth and mostly change. And I think that's really hopeful, particularly when we look at these systems that feel so daunting and impactful, but we're all humans together, hopefully working towards something better. But so I think you highlight a really important piece, though, that harm and achieving an outcome that is disconnected from your intended good will indicate that there's a system that's broken.
Yeah, and that there's also something that you were talking about, like with this imperfection, is that in roles, we all develop habits like cognitive shortcuts, which sort of orient us to behave in particular ways. And that there's, like, in some cases, there's training around like how to act. And then other times it's like individual discretion of how to interact with people. And so there's habits that are developed within institutions and amongst people and within individuals that reinforce particular kinds of interactions.
And their habits, by calling them habits, and I think that's a really important piece, it means that they're pre-reflection, right? We're not really thinking about our habits, we just do them. So we're not really conscious of them. But we need, in order to understand broken systems, we have to be aware of them, but then we also have to heighten our awareness of the habits that are informing what we do, the decisions we make, how we're valuing, how we're knowing, what information we're paying attention to, right? Where are our blinders? Because we are efficient thinkers. That's part of our brain functioning. And so how do we interrupt that a little bit to understand where we might be going wrong?
Yeah, and I find it extremely helpful to think about bias and bias in individuals and bias in systems as the absence of relevant questions. And so, for example, Shauna, who's great to see you and thinking about in the chat, but happens to work with my cousin around informed consent for Inuit women, amongst many other things. And so that idea of the sort of the absence of the questions around what do Inuit people need to do to get more accessible healthcare or appropriate healthcare is one that hadn't really been thought to be asked for quite some time. It's just like send them south to where they can go to large hospitals where they don't have translation and they don't have community-based healthcare. So those kinds of questions are sort of, they're a bias because they're not, they weren't even thought to be asked. And now that there's the questions of like, what do Inuit people actually need for healthcare to meet their needs in the North? Then there's an opportunity for further kinds of answers, which may generate change. And Claire, you have a question there too.
Yeah, I was kind of just thinking about these like roles sort of, and thinking about the apartment building example. Like in some ways, if you have an apartment building where it's all these people living together, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering more about the complexity of like, could there be an intention of building community that's maybe not, I think like sort of in the concept of people living together, maybe that's sort of inherent, right? But then I think about like interactions in the elevator where like you won't talk to someone unless someone talks to you first. It's like, how does that sort of, is that a habit or is that coming from some, it's like sort of like a spur of the moment habit kind of, where it's like you're mimicking a behavior that is presented to you. I'm curious where that sort of fits into the system. Like maybe that's just unintentional, but is that another level of this, or am I making it too complicated?
No, I don't think you're making it too complicated at all. I think that the reality is that these systems are super complex and that there are all kinds of intersecting systems. So there's not, or goods of order. I mean, there's not just, here's the apartment building on its own and it's, very neat and tidy, and then here's whatever. So I think that I love what you're saying, that there are the neighbors, that there's a culture really that develops based on the people who move in. And maybe, the first people who moved in really didn't, they like big city living. They didn't care about their neighbor. They wanted to be anonymous, and then as new people, but that can change and that can shift. And so, I mean, on the one hand, that could be written or that can be unspoken, And so I think that that's another kind of component of goods of order. So if the intended good of the good of order within the apartment building around neighbors, right, is a community that keeps to themselves, then there are going to be habits of interaction that facilitate that. And when people come in later who feel, isolated within this community, then there might be like, wait a second, why are we not talking in the elevator? Why is this the way? And, that maybe there's some dialogue and some change, but to change the good of order so that the intended good is a more, is a community that cares for one another more, is more intentional about its being welcome to one another. But I think you're absolutely right. And you're really highlighting that one, it's the decisions of all of us together that creates these things. Systems and habits can be implicit, right? And not really written, but kind of developed based on what individuals want, cultural, whatever. And that all of these systems are intertwined in that they're kind of pushing on each other. So, you and I may be coming from totally different places. And so how are we going to negotiate how we want to live, or what we want the good to be of our community? So, Marnie?
No, Megan, it's because we're now moving into what we talked about is really the core of this conversation is like, so we have a sort of the terms and relations about like a system and the goods of order and the roles and the interiority of decision making, that it's people who are making those decisions, and sometimes they can be kind of truncated, so nobody talks to each other in the elevator, or more expansive where there's a sort of a more thriving sense of connection, let's say, if that's really what the intended good is. And I can, as looking around and knowing most of you, knowing that there's efforts that people are making to support that kind of change towards more flourishing and towards better kinds of connection and interaction. And often, if you were the person in the elevator and you say hello and you're kind of met with that kind of like, ooh, that sort of response. So knowing that everybody's had that experience too, as you've tried to make changes within the police force, within defense, within a communications organization, or within a hospital, that there's that sense of like, that kind of like, not really knowing what to do about change. So Megan, what are some of your thoughts on that?
On what to do?
Yeah.
So I think it really comes down to that idea of heightening awareness, right? Making those, what is implicit, what we don't usually pay attention to, more explicit. And when it comes to broken systems, right, the first thing we have to do is identify and articulate, well, what's the harm, or what's the disconnect? What's the thing that matters? So it might be that people aren't talking to each other in the elevator. It might be that there's disparity in healthcare. It might be, a bazillion other things, unfairness in voting, long lines at the Department of Motor Vehicles. But you need to.
Let's just pause on that, because that's a gap. And I think that's really important to recognize, is that that within that, like, whatever the problem is some kind of gap between what you as somebody kind of recognizes as an aspiration of like healthcare for all, and then, oh, I noticed that Indigenous people are dying more frequently, or sent home thinking that they're alcoholic and they're actually having a stroke. So you notice, okay, there's a gap between this performance that is optimal and what is actually happening. Or you notice that, wow, I've been in a place where there was lots of people talking in the elevator, and this is not where it is. So there's some kind of gap that you register, and you register that, like whoever the change maker is, in your sense of valuing. There's something it's a gap rather than a fit when we have when we register that there's some kind of problem or something that might need to be changed.
Yes. Let me just see, I see Mariano put something. With respect to gap, does this mean a system be broken without mutiny within the system? A system can be broken without mutiny within the system? Yeah. I think so, because it's the outcome, is what's happening, is what are all of these efforts working towards the intention, or is there a disconnect? Is there a gap between what the intended outcome is and what's actually happening? Oh my gosh, I had a really good example of this earlier, and now I can't remember it, but they're everywhere.
Also, Mariana, the idea of mutiny, again, when we look at sort of what's mutiny, well, we know that mutiny is some kind of conflict behavior that's generated from threat. And so first of all, people have to kind of discern the threat. And so if nobody kind of has recognized that Indigenous people are dying more frequently because they're misdiagnosed and sent home, no one has the question to ask that. And so there's no mutiny. And now there's kind of this growing recognition of like, yeah, there's real inequities and there's differential treatment. And so it's not necessary. So it was broken, and now this awareness, and so the mutiny, if we think about that again in insight terms, which I'm so appreciative of, because there's a precision within that but it's some kind of conflict behavior that's generated threat. And so sometimes change really can bring that about if the change is seen as it's top down and it's not inclusive, or there's some kind of other sort of threat that goes on. Change can be very difficult. Megan, you probably have things to say about that as well.
No, yeah, I think that once there's mutiny, that means a lot of people are, yes, deciding to, just like you say, Marnie, are deciding to use conflict behavior to defend against that, to stop it, to, to combat it. And then you have then you have another problem on top, right? So you've got the mutiny and the gap, which is more to solve. So, so we're talking about gaps, and in order to identify and ultimately change a broken system, you've got to identify the gap. And then, because systems, goods of order, are recurrent, they're actual systems, they produce something over and over again, we have to make sure that it wasn't just like a whoopsie or a mistake or a trip, that the harm is something that's actually countable. I mean, it's something that also recurs. Yes, 25% of people are discharged from the hospital when they should have been kept in the hospital, right, for reasons of racism and bias. So you got to count it a little bit and make sure that it's actually so. It's kind of a verification of, oh my gosh, there's a harm, there's a disconnect, there's a gap. Is it so? Yeah, it's so. There's the data. And then, so then what, right? Okay, we're documenting this, but what do we do about it? And so what we would say as insight practitioners is that you really need to start to uncover what are the patterns of patterns of cooperation that are sustaining this production of harm, or this production of an inadequate intended good, of this gap between what's aspired for, what's hoped for, what's meant to be achieved, and what's actually being produced. So the patterns of cooperation then are that's what links back to the person in the role. What's the decision making of and the decision making is more than just the decision making, right? It's the valuing and the knowing that go into every choice and every behavior, and also those carriers of consciousness, the habits that are informing the knowing, the significance, and the actions of individuals within these patterns of cooperation. So much more opens up around what can be discovered in order to identify, well, where are the breakdowns? Is it because we haven't asked the relevant questions? Is it that we're not open enough? Is it that, I don't know, the system itself, the way that we've agreed to work together isn't actually functioning, not talking in the elevator isn't really getting us the community that we want.
I want to add in a little bit of nuance here too, Megan, because I happen to know that people like Sandy and others are working on have been working on the issues about microaggressions, which sort of may not have kind of documented evidence. And in those cases where people are sort of struggling with like a lack of promotion, or a sense of like having to work extra hard just to sort of get the same approval, it can be one of those very difficult to name patterns of interaction that accrue in invisible ways, that kind of gather up. And so those kinds of things are, I think, just coming onto the horizon, because that's where we're also, like, another important word about like horizon of what is possible for us to know and value and decide about. And so how there can be ways of engaging in the moment or in transparency around how we treat each other, or what respectful behavior looks like, that may be beyond the realm of like policy, but become a way of the practices that we talk about, like calling people in or standing up. There can be also subtle ways that we change. And so there's also, for me, a sense of recognizing the importance and influence that we have in our own roles to be able to shift when we ourselves are more expansive or more skilled and can respond to those kinds of microaggressions, or stand up as a bystander for when we see them. So those kinds of parts of organizational life I think are becoming more talked about and more emergent and much more challenging, but much more part of the everyday.
Mhm. Well, and you talk about a personal responsibility there. I mean, if we all, if any system, if any good of order is a function of the people who are participating within it, then it is up to us to make the decision to stand up, to be aware of our own microaggressions, to call someone out when we see that, or, you know, in a way that is curious, I think. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. And again, it really does strengthen that connection that we don't often pay attention to between the people who are acting in order to create, sustain, or change systems.
And then what kind of support that we can give to others who are changing it, or that we ourselves might be able to do. And so this is about sort of looking at the interiority of our own decision making, like how truncated am I as I encounter somebody who is an example from my daughter's school is where a graduating class, a number of the students who are gender diverse were not invited to the final grad party that had everybody else included. And so the sense of like being able to respond, okay, so I have a role of parent and I'm not a school administrator, and yet this injustice happened. And do I talk to the parents? Do I talk to the administration about doing bystander training? So I'm in my option generating where I've recognized this gap. I see it as an injustice, and I don't want to do conflict behavior by calling up the kid who didn't invite the other kids, which would be a kind of a conflict behavior of like imposing some parental authority. And my daughter wasn't even involved. Like she's not even in the graduating class. But it's a sense for me of this is just not okay. And so how do I do that in a way that's really skillful? And so that's a work in progress. But it's a sense of like recognizing, okay, there was this gap. I can feel that they've got sort of a personal threat and want to go and like be mad at somebody, but I don't want to act in conflict behavior. I want to be able to think about the good that we're intending. I want to start having conversations with people that's not sort of me coming from a place of certainty. I want to be able to invite their curiosity in. So did you notice the gap? What do you make of the gap? How do you feel that what could we do about the gap? And so we're just starting to have conversations about that amongst other parents, and starting to have those conversations to talk about the implicit carriers, because ironically the school had just had a like rainbow day, like literally the week before. And so like there was a lot of celebration of rainbow people, and then the rainbow people were excluded. And so it's not only about celebrating I get to be me as a rainbow person, is that how do we genuinely invite rainbow people into the graduating class, for example, the class party? Those are very difficult questions. Do other people have sort of thoughts or comments? Oh, anything else that you want to add?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate what you're saying. Let's see, Paige, we have some things in the chat here, but I really appreciate your example, Marnie, because it just illustrates how difficult it can be, right? And we're always on a personal level grappling with these systems, not necessarily recognizing that they are systems, but they are, and they affect us very, very personally. And then there's a whole skill set around navigating those in ways that don't lead to another broken system of disconnect, of conflict, of breakdown. So it's not easy, even in the least, to be engaged here. Let's see, what does Paige have to say? Hi, Paige. How might we approach the question of whose intended good? That's a very good question. I think we need to understand this to change the collective heuristics and form these patterns of cooperation within systems that are, by definition, powerfully self-reinforcing.
And so, Paige, that's a fantastic question in terms of like, so the intended good of the people, the party inviters, was to actually have like a fun time at their graduation. And so they didn't want to invite the weird people, let's say, because that would have maybe jeopardized their intended good of like having like drinking and smoking pot. And so that was, that's what they wanted. That was their intended good. And in the meantime, they ended up like creating for other people. Like I had a crappy grad because like we had the celebration, but I wasn't invited to any parties. So that's a very, like, that's a tension that is right there. And so it is a question of who's intended good, who has privilege and power. You know, all of those questions really do need to be grappled with. And who am I as a parent to kind of, you know, force those kids to invite everybody and then end up having a party where everybody stands around like we're inclusive, but we're really bored. So those are really tricky, really, really tricky. Do you have anything you want to say more on that page? Because you asked it as a question, but I know you have a lot of experience with it.
No, I just wonder about even being able to hold those questions, because as you speak, Marty, about inequities in healthcare, right? And I think, well, the system was set up for that, right? So that seems like a very effective system for how it was set up. So when we then change our kind of culturally intended goods, when we understand those things differently, how do we change those systems to catch up? Because of course everyone wants to go back to the status quo, and of course, and that's, I think it's that powerfully reinforcing part of systems that is so tough to get out of. And so really, how do we, ultimately, I think the question is, how do we get people to, you know, grapple with those questions of power and see their intended good as potentially harmful to others? And I'm hoping you can answer that in this webinar. I assume so.
I think it's a great question, Paige. And I think that requires a lot of research, right? It's asking, what is your intended good here? And then to be able to extract the diversity of intended goods, which there no doubt are, because there's a diversity of people who are cooperating together to sustain the particular systems, right? So what are all the intended goods, you know, and then you can kind of begin to paint a picture, and even getting people, even doing it ourselves, but paying attention to that, because we don't, oh, this is what I'm meaning to achieve. I mean, that's actually very hard to articulate. I want to achieve, you know, I want to set up a system of healthcare for everybody, but I'm not even thinking about people who I'm leaving out, you know? So maybe just articulating, be like, oh, wow, I'm not meeting that. I had no idea, can open up all kinds of possibilities. Now that, again, there may be people who say, I want healthcare just for my people. And then you can kind of say, well, let's poke that a little bit. What's so important about it being just for you? What's the matter with opening it up to others, you know? And then we begin to generate some insights around that might expand that kind of truncated intended good. But I think that the question of who's intended good leads us to the reality that there are a diversity of intended goods within any system. And so to elicit those and bring them out and start to penetrate them with curiosity will yield this mass of data, of information that can be then used to get a bigger picture and opportunities for intervention.
Yeah, and I'd add another little bit in there, which, so Leela's asks a really good question of like, can systems do that? And it's individuals within systems that do that. And so like I used to work as an ombudsman for Health Canada. And so there was a whole process that systems do in Health Canada about, there's like the inspectors go and verify natural health product claims. And so they do that verifying. They're carried by the valuing of the organization as like, we want to protect people from fraudulent natural health products. And so we've got policies that can do that. And that we're also very risk averse as an organization. And so we don't want to generate any kind of precedent, like all of the values and the valuing is embedded within policies and procedures within organizations. And then the deciding comes out of that. We want to prosecute or we don't, or we will. So those are all, so you can say that Health Canada is doing this, but it is actually individuals and groups within this large organization that are making decisions every day, and that inspectors have particular discretions, and that they're also guided by policy. So it's tempting to think about systems doing something, but it's really quite amazing. It's like looking in a microscope and all of a sudden seeing all these swirling atoms, to be able to think about systems in this very fluid and yet structured way. So then to come back to the idea of what we were just talking around about who's intended good, I think it can also be really helpful, because one of the challenges that people again kind of get into is to think about individuals or identities as a kind of a fixed thing. And if we think about carriers or narratives, I think that can be really important. So again, there's a number of different narratives. So we're learning more and more about how like whiteness is a carrier that that there's sort of whiteness is as a norm against which others are defined. And there's also a carrier of equity for all despite color and differences. And so those are both carriers that one person individually can have in their mind, and that they can then start again to recognize what it is that's carrying my decision making and carrying my valuing, and then to start being oriented to what is the higher aspiration, what is the sort of the one that I want or that is most just. That those are those possibilities that also become evident. So to not only talk about who's intended good, but what are the carriers that carry the intended good can be very, very powerful.
Mhm.
Marnie or Megan, can I ask, I'm processing as you guys are talking, and I'm trying to apply what we're talking about to, like, say for instance, big topic is vaccinations for COVID. And so I can, like, for, the intention from public health, from our government in getting vaccinated, it totally makes sense. Healthcare provider, totally makes sense. But I really find it challenging to have a conversation with people who will come up and tell me how ridiculous it is to get vaccinated and how there's all these conspiracies out there. And I really find I get challenged and, like, I think it's ridiculous, but I can't understand why people think that way. And to even go through this process of the loop, like, what do you do with that? Like, how, what are they valuing? I can't even imagine what they're valuing. The evidence is out there. Do you know what I mean? So using that as an example, because it is a bigger system issue, right? If people don't get vaccinated, we're going to continue in this.
Right. So there are people who don't want to participate in this system, right? In the system of vaccines that's been rolled out by the government, to ostensibly protect everyone. And when you want to participate in that system and you're confronted by those who aren't participating in that system and perhaps putting others at risk, it's challenging. And so I think number one is what's your valuing around it, right? And so getting clear as you can, which is not always easy, around your own kind of knowing, valuing, and then so how do you get curious, I think, is your question when you feel so just averse to that kind of lack of participation. And I think and it's about recognizing that their decision making is linked to a certain valuing, and so you just want to explore that. Okay, so and a certainty of knowing, and that all of that is carried by whatever it might be. So being carried by past experience, by culture, by other threats, by whatever might have happened to people in the past, or so. There is that very, very personal aspect of not participating in a system that might compromise that system of vaccinations. And to get curious, you want to know, well, what's threatening around getting the vaccines? How do you know that that is threatening? What makes you so sure? Just having those conversations allows people, it's really kind of a gift. And even the conversation itself can open us up. It's not like any of us is fully expanded all the time, hardly at all. So getting curious not only helps us understand ourselves, but when you get to what's their valuing, what's that valuing based in, then it generates the opportunity for them to also, the other person to also have insights and start to question themselves.
And there's a way of being able to sort of recognize it as valuing. And it's so there's and I'm not saying, because when I'm truncated, I'm very certain as well. But I do know that we can never kind of open up somebody's head and kind of pour our ideas in. And like, if I just say it in a different way or say it with a louder voice, then they'll get it, so that's, but it is something about, so you're really concerned about the amount of people getting vaccinated because you're really convinced that this whole vaccination thing is a conspiracy. And so it seems like the right thing to do then to kind of resist vaccination, because it just seems ridiculous. Have I got that? And so it's just sort of like just on that level. And there's some kind of narrative image that, some kind of sense of like, okay, and it almost seems like you're resisting those terrible pharmaceutical companies because they're making a bunch of money. And oh yeah, there was a history of like of people of color being kind of getting sterilized with vaccinations that may make you kind of resistant to this, or you don't really trust the mainstream media, or any of those things that kind of like may produce that. So have I got kind of what your resistances are? And then do you ever kind of wonder what might be motivating the kinds of like might motivate lots of people to be getting vaccinated, or what might be the downside as you see it of not getting vaccinated, just sort of that idea of like, so and if there is no downside, what do you like? It just becomes that sense, and it may not be at that point, it might not be even that sort of point of convincing, but at least you're not generating further resistance or a threat as well, because the effort of convincing is a kind of defense. I know that one well, is the convincing is also a threat and a defense. And so a kind of a non-defensive curiosity is already a sort of a fairly, is like a win for me personally, but then also maybe, in relation to the people, the polarizing dynamic that we are also involved in, maybe that effort to just like, let me try and understand you in your own terms, and then maybe you can try and understand me in my own terms. Like that can be another move to say, so if I really try and understand you in your terms, will you do the same for me? And then you don't have to agree with me, but at least you can try and understand me. And that sort of sense of understanding doesn't necessarily mean agreement. So those are some options, but I'm like saying, like I, as an armchair, in that armchair conflict, that's the principle, but I've got a ways to go there too.
I think that's really well put, Marnie. And Leela, I think you capture it very well, inserting uncertainty into the system. And I think that's a nice way to capture some of that dialogue.
Claire, you ask a good question about figuring out who's intended good. And so how does one measure that in research? It's a really interesting question around, so it's not so much the question about method like qualitative or quantitative, but what kind of questions you're asking. And so being able to say like, we probably need a more specific example, but to, so I can't think of one in mind, but it's more the form of questions to be able to elicit that response. And then it could be how many people said this, or what was the qualitative response. So your question is a really good one. And then you went, okay, so how does one measure that? And then you went to a fairly, is that qualitative or quantitative? So it's just sort of the power of the question is that question won't get you very far with qualitative or quantitative. The other questions can take you very, very far in terms of what are the right questions to ask. And that's what I find so powerful about questions is sometimes they just lead nowhere, and sometimes they can really lead to significant possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, misinformation is huge and difficult. I mean, I think that one's one to wrap our head around, and it's kind of what is so, well, I think it also comes down to valuing, but what is so gripping often about misinformation? And I think it's because of how some stories, some misinformation generates significance for us or raises threat. And so because we are oriented to defend, some information that's not true that might bear on our safety or something that's significant to us, we latch onto. And there's a lot to unpack in misinformation, but that would definitely disrupt systems.
Leela's point about uncertainty into the system as well is quite lovely, because there is something about certainty. And so misinformation, if it generates a sense of certainty about within a lot of uncertainty, there can be a simple narrative within misinformation of no, that's not true, or here's the simple narrative. And simplicity and certainty are cognitively comforting in many, many cases. And it takes a lot more more cognitive work to deal with uncertainty without threat. And so that's another sort of element. And so, as Leela says, about inserting uncertainty into the system so that curiosity can be generated, but sometimes even that uncertainty can be sort of recognized as threat. And just as, even in the elevator example, if you say, for me, if I say hello to somebody, that could be some kind of threat, like I'm actually acting out of the pattern of regular cooperation. And so therefore I'm kind of weird. And what else might I do? I might hug them, like that sort of sense of like, first it's a hello and then who knows? So there's also those kind of, that's a problem of change making. We have about 3 more minutes. So what else is there to either to start sort of summarizing, if people want to sort of start contributing what it is that because it's been so incredibly rich. I'm kind of wondering about sort of adding to the chat or in person about what were highlights or take home so that we can all kind of reflect on that a little bit more together. That's kind of where my mind is going. How about you, Megan?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. So either in the chat or just unmuting, it would really be helpful for Megan and I to just kind of sit back a little bit and for you to just talk about like what was highlights or what was useful, because that would be really, really settling for me, to be totally transparent. And I could also just call on people if that would be easier and you can pass, or how do you want to do this? What's the process?
Shauna says, change making is very brave work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd be very happy to, like everything you've said, I totally align with. And I've been in a situation recently where, advocating for change, recognizing the system, recognizing the colonial imprint, working with Indigenous women. However, it was it's in a system, not was, is in a system where there was some dysfunction. I'll say a deviation from the mission, vision, value of the org.
Mm.
And that's why I tuned in tonight, because I really wanted to hear both of you speak about this from an insight perspective. And it is really hard work to vocalize, to challenge the status quo in a non-confrontational, non-conflict way. And so, I really appreciate this approach from a systems perspective. And I, was really looking for some ins in this very difficult situation in Canada with this, current situation with Indigenous peoples and the colonialism, and in an organization that's a not-for-profit with some deviation from the mission, vision, and value, and I applaud those who can challenge the status quo. So thank you for this. It's been very helpful for me.
Thank you, Shauna. It is difficult and tiring and dispiriting sometimes, and there's also that where the replenishing comes from. And so, like to the degree it's hopeful, like that's it's really nice to have you here. It really matters that you came and are also like contributing. So thank you for that. And there's been lots more in the chat. And then the question from Ken about sharing something more about the carrier of consciousness, so we can kind of come back to that. But anyone else wants to sort of speak a takeaway or something that was useful? Yeah, Marianne's curiosity is invaluable, and you don't have to throw away the system from Claire, and that helps us to avoid moving into the conflict behavior from Dymphny and unintentional, and just also about some from Kim about that sharing what we know can be a threat, very, very useful. And that, yeah, from Vanessa about being part of the system as well is so key, that we're a part about. And yeah, looking at what the actual intentions are It's really useful. And yeah, that's with Leela about how policies are the way that they are, kind of the values and the valuing of systems and organizations, and then being able to recognize them as such. Sandy, I see that your hand's up, or that like your little mechanical hand is up. Nice to see you, by the way, Sandy. Thanks for coming.
Hi. Yeah, it's good to be here. I found, and I think I echo a lot of people I see it in the group, one of the biggest takeaways for me was how inserting uncertainty in the system can be seen as a threat.
Mhm.
That is what I've been experiencing right now, like just sharing what you know. I think somebody wrote that sharing what you know can be seen as a threat, and how to overcome that, especially when you're working within a system that has good intentions and people think they're aligned, but are working in sometimes traumatic structures passed down from bad systems that were existing before. So yeah, that is one of the biggest takeaways, and how to do that. Like, how can curiosity be mistaken for threat, and then tactics to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just on that note, and just knowing how skilled you are already in that, Sandy, but there's a way in like sort of that prefacing it with, just with when we were talking with Kim, is to say like, so, like this is a very delicate topic. And so, how, like, my intention here is to actually like, how can we exchange information or be able to, share views where we don't get into conflict behavior. So I'm just sort of wondering about, how we can share this information that we have so that we can actually learn from each other, along those lines. So recognizing that there is a threat, to be able to anticipate it, and then sort of work on a way that it's kind of diffusing, even, in the case of like trying to dismantle racism in an organization, very, very challenging. And so those become ways of, of like, as so many people are saying, like, so with Claire about like, how do you talk about the gap in a way, and then it may be like, how do we fill the gap a little bit more, or how does the system need to change, like having more Indigenous people in the system, and then how does the system change, like where the restorative justice possibilities come, like there may be systems changes that are needed, and then there may be ways that the system can adapt. And that's the ongoing debates in so many of our systems, that continues to be a tension, and there can be a creative tension in that, and it can also be a kind of a destructive tension. Is there anything more that you wanted to say on that, Sandy?
No, I think you've covered that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else from people? And unless there's a little bit more, okay, so then the page is something. And then Megan, do you want to say anything more about carriers of consciousness in the sort of the remaining two minutes?
Oh, I think maybe that deserves a whole nother session.
Yeah, great. I think that would be a sort of backed by popular demand.
Mhm.
Would be really, really good. So maybe we should do a Broken Systems Part 2, Carriers of Consciousness. And so it'd be nice to have as many of us kind of reassemble, because it really does feel like it's the start of a conversation. So we can put that on the agenda. Yeah, so we've got a lot of yes pleases. So let's think about that. So people who want to participate can watch the video, and then we can schedule something onwards. And so let's make sure we pick up Paige's last thing about pressures put on individuals as system change agents. Yeah, so that's back to Shauna's point about it is a lot of pressure to do that kind of work. And so how we can stay well, all of us, amongst that pressure to change the systems. And curiosity and compassion being a great big one as well, being huge. Yeah, thank you everybody for all of this really wonderful dialogue, wonderful conversation, and maybe I'll be just a little bit better people, better versions of ourselves as we kind of go out and do the next right thing.
All right. Yes, thank you. So wonderful to see everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evenings or afternoons or whatever they may be, and we will see you next time.
I actually just wanted to pop in. This is my first time at anything with Insight in general, so I wanted to first say thank you, because this was excellent, and I'm just like being exposed to